Well, we're back, and I have a good plan forward to reload this old gun, the 8mm Mauser and the Mauser M48 bolt-action rifle. Now, when we're working up these loads, I noticed quite a long time ago that the range of powder charges is very generous, let's say. It starts at 43.0 grains of Varget for this 170 grain Hornady SST, all the way through 50.5 or 50.5 grains of Varget. That's a 7.5 grain spread between the minimum and maximum charge. Now, we always start at the minimum charge, no matter what we think about that load. Now, what I did to save me a little time is I went straight to an OCW, or optimal charge weight, type of workup. So I started at 43 grains and then worked it up, firing 8 or 9 rounds. But what I noticed is that as I was charging those cases, that they were really about half or 60% full only. That's about the lightest charge I've ever thrown in a rifle. And as a result of that, when firing it, it was such a low pressure load that the primers were actually backing out a little bit. Now, there was no leakage of the primers. Nothing was blasting out on the bolt face. But it still wasn't correct. It wasn't right. So kind of back to the drawing board. And what I did is I started 2 new workups. The first was a standard workup starting near the maximum of where I ended up with the OCW. But then I was working up those loads in half grain increments. Then, after firing those loads, I studied the results of those things. Of course, I chronographed those loads, and I studied those muzzle velocities and the muzzle velocity curve. I looked at how those shots were placing on the target, looking for a ladder type of effect, which for me never works out quite as good as OCW type of approach. And then based on those results, I worked up yet another load following OCW. Now, the difference between a standard workup and OCW is the standard workup jumps half grain increments. Half grain increments. OCW jumps by 0.2 of a grain increments. So instead of 0.5 grain differences between loads, it's 0.2 grain differences. And this then allows us to find that sill that's really important to crafting very, very consistent and obviously then accurate, or normally then accurate ammo. So the load that I worked up in the previous episode of Extreme Reloading, I'm calling Session 1. We're going to kind of follow through with this nomenclature throughout this whole episode. Then when I did a standard workup, the half grain incrementing, I'm calling that Session 2. And then Session 3 is the second OCW workup. So Session 2 starts at 44.5 grains of Varget powder, which is on the tail end of where we kind of left off with Session 1. And I fired 8 rounds there, all the way up to 48.0 grains. Still 2.5 grains shy of maximum, but that's just fine. Now, why not go to maximum? Well, we're reloading a very old gun. This rifle was produced in somewhere between 1948 and the early 1950s. So I'm not pushing it. I'm not pushing it to get the maximum velocity. What I'm looking for is an accurate round that's safe to fire and will allow me to keep shooting this gun for years and years to come. We talked about that in episode number 1 of Extreme Reloading this season. Now, the results of that workup, session number 2, were just fantastic. There was no signs of pressure whatsoever, and the nice thing is that those primers sucked back in. They're looking like a normal spent primer by the time I got done with them all. Muzzle velocities ranged from 2,349 feet per second all the way to 2,552. Remember session 3, we're looking at optimal charge weight again, And here I'm shooting again 8 rounds ranging from 46.6 grains of Varget through the same 48 grains. I'm incrementing these by 2/10 of a grain using the same Hornady brass, or very, very similar Hornady brass in all cases, and of course the same Hornady SST 170 grain bullets. The range of muzzle velocities for session number 3 was 2,497 through 2,597. So essentially a perfect 100 feet per second range in muzzle velocities. And again, no signs of pressure problems. But would you look at this? What a strong sill we have observed here. Loads 3, 4, and 5, that's charges of 47.0, 47.2, and 47.4 grains of Varget produced an extremely strong sill. I really like to see that. You know, sometimes our sill will only be across 2 loads, but we're seeing it across 3 loads, and that's a very, very good sign. The other thing that I'm seeing on paper is that this rifle is actually grouping pretty darn well, and we really don't anticipate it grouping pretty darn well at this point, because every load we're firing, every round we're firing, has a different powder charge behind it. So we shouldn't expect too much, but yet we're seeing this thing group pretty darn well. Now I like to analyze this stuff, so I graph the results from session 1, session 2, and session 3 all together. And isn't it interesting how this very generalized trend was formed? In fact, the R² value that describes that linear relationship is very, very high, an R² of 0.97. That tells us that 97% of the variability that we're seeing in muzzle velocities can be explained by those differences in powder charges. But what's interesting is that session 2 actually falls below that linear trend line. The residuals aren't huge. That's the difference between the expected on the trend line and actually the observed that we saw. Why is this? Well, I kind of looked into that, went back on my records and looked at the temperature, ambient temperatures that session number 2 is fired at, which was 32 degrees. Session number 3 was fired at 24 degrees. And session number 1 was fired at 37 degrees. So that really doesn't explain the difference there either. Varget is fairly temperature insensitive, so I really wouldn't expect too much difference in velocities due to temperature. And if anything, we should have seen kind of a consistency in those differences. In other words, when I fired session number 1 at 37 degrees, those should have been maybe a little higher than the trend line. And then session number 3, fired at coldest, that one should have been likely below the trend line. That's not what we saw. The brass cases themselves were pretty darn similar in all instances, so we can't point at, well, this was a batch of light cases with a high case capacity. This was a batch of heavy cases with a smaller case capacity. Nothing like that. That doesn't hold true either. The only thing that can make somewhat of a difference is the actual chronograph that I used to measure these velocities. Now, session number 1, I used my trusty old Ehler Model 33. That's fantastic chronograph. I have no problems with it. But then on my sessions 2 and sessions 3, I used a brand new lab radar system for chronographing those loads. That's a very nice system as well. We're going to do a special on the lab radar coming up here. One thing that I really like about the lab radar is it's really fast to set up. So I appreciate that, and that's about the big problem that I have with the Ehler. If you're going to fire only a couple of rounds and you're going to spend 15 to 20 minutes setting up the Ehler, and then 15 to 20 minutes maybe taking down the Ehler, well, that's kind of a pain. The lab radar is really, really simple to set up. But it could be that these two instruments do not necessarily exactly agree with one another. I want to do a little bit of experimenting with that, and that could be what's going on. But back to the 8mm Mauser and working up this load, I think we have a pretty straight path forward. And on our next episode of Extreme Reloading, we're going to be shooting for groups. I hope you join in. Watch for it coming out in just a couple of weeks, and thanks for watching this episode of Extreme Reloading.